afternoon program, each of you. Good to see you. Nice to see some familiar faces as well as some new faces as we speak about the Methuselah factor. Let's have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you that you are anxious to bless us. Father, please help us to have receptive minds so that we can learn what you would have us do and how you would have us more effectively minister on your behalf. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. Well, I don't know if you've ever thought about the question or not, but are these devices that we have, whether they be watches or smartphones or clocks on our walls, are these devices, are they our friends or our enemies? Have you ever thought about it? Do you wish we could just throw away all these things? And some of you may say yes, others of you are shaking your heads no. Well, let's put it this way. None of you would have been here on time, likely, if you didn't have some type of timekeeping device, right? But what's really interesting to me as a physician and as a pastor, as I meet with people, especially as they get older, they wish they could somehow turn the clock backwards. Instead of getting older, they would like to get younger. Maybe some of you can relate. Well, this may sound like science fiction, but actually there is a medical science that suggests that we can at least turn back the clock on some of the effects of aging. And that factor actually is something called hemorrheology. Now, it's a complex subject. There's whole books, whole societies, whole medical journals that talk about hemorrheology. But if you were simply to look at a medical dictionary, you would find that it was defined as the science of the physical properties of blood flow in the circulatory system. If that doesn't sound scholarly enough, how about this one? The science of the relation of pressures, flow, volumes, and resistances in blood vessels. You say, well, okay, what all does that mean? Well, hemorrheology, if you really break the word down, it is simply hemo, which refers to blood, and rheology, that refers to the flow properties of complex matter or substances. Some of you, I know, are engineers in our midst. At least I've met one of you. You may have had to study rheology as it related maybe to civil engineering and dealing with, for example, waste from a city. You have to understand the flow properties as you design systems. It's the same with the body. The Creator has taken special care to make sure blood fluidity is designed to be optimal. Unfortunately, we have found many ways to undermine our blood flow, and we're going to talk about that together. Really, we're talking about the science of the red blood cell. What is it that can help our red blood cells get to our tissues most effectively, carrying oxygen, taking away carbon dioxide, bringing nutrients? Let me tell it to you this way, and this may seem counterintuitive, but if you were to be driving on a road here in the UAE and they were doing construction, and you looked ahead and you determined that the passable area of the roadway was narrower than the width of your car, what would you do? Yeah, you'd turn around, right? Or you'd back up. I mean, if the road, if they've got all kinds of, concrete blocks and other things, they're doing some repair maybe, and you look and you say, yeah, a motorcycle could get through there, but I've got a sedan. There's no way I can get through there. You're just going to turn around. Well, think about it this way. Your red blood cell is over twice as wide as the smallest capillaries in your body. So you say, well, how does that work? How does that work? How does a red blood cell then get into those tiny capillaries? The Creator has designed the red blood cell with a unique shape. You may not appreciate it in this picture, but it is like a donut without a hole. Instead of having a hole in the donut, it just has a depression. It's what we call a biconcave disc. It's like an inner tube, if you will, with a membrane instead of a hole. It allows the red blood cell to fold over on itself and squeeze through the capillaries. This is not a defect in design. This is evidence of the Creator's master design. Because as the red blood cell squeezes through the capillaries, it maximizes contact between the red blood cell and the blood vessel wall. Here's the problem with it, though. If your red blood cells are not healthy, if they get stiff, if the red blood cells clump together, then they can't fold over on each other and your microcirculation suffers. Researchers have found when your microcirculation suffers, it can cause all kinds of problems. Let's just look at the list. Before I do, let me show you a cutting-edge statement about hemorrheology written over 100 years ago by someone by the name of E.G. White, who I think some of you are acquainted with. Here are her words. Perfect health depends on perfect circulation. Now, I'm sure many people, when they read those words, when they were written, or in subsequent decades, they said, oh, what nice poetry. But I would like to suggest to you today, this is cutting-edge medical science. What God revealed to the prophet is something that today, if we implemented it, our health would be dramatically better. Why? What is hemorrheology connected with? Well, in my book, The Methuselah Factor, I actually begin with about 12 chapters that spell out 12 different conditions that are helped by optimizing blood fluidity. I want to introduce you to them. They are found in the first figure in the book. Since most of you can't read that, we've taken the liberty to enlarge it for you and to look at this list. We'll spend a little bit of time with a few of these things, but we'll try to spend most of our time talking about how you can improve your blood fluidity, how you can improve your hemorrheology. Now, perhaps before I go any further, some of you are very confused. You say, wait a minute, this guy's talking about hemorrheology. The lecture is billed as the Methuselah Factor. How does this all relate? Well, I've been giving lectures on this topic for many years, long before I wrote the book. In fact, some years ago, I spoke for 6 hours to health professionals, mostly physicians, talking with them about how if they applied hemorrheology in their practices, their patients would get better. But I noticed something when I spoke with lay audiences on this topic. I would speak maybe for an hour, maybe 2 hours about this topic. People would leave excited, and then they'd be asked a question like, well, what was the lecture all about? And they'd say, well, it was about and they just had a hard time, some people, remembering hemorrheology. So to make it easy, I decided to call it the Methuselah Factor. Now, why would I call this science of optimal blood flow the Methuselah Factor? Any of you have any insights? Okay, yes, you know about Methuselah. According to the Bible, he was the longest lived person on planet Earth, right? So do we have any blood work on Methuselah? Any documentation in the scriptures as to what his complete blood count was, or any measurements at all, do we? No, we have absolutely nothing. But I can assure you of this. Anyone who lived 969 years on planet Earth had excellent hemorrheology. So Methuselah is an example of someone who had optimal blood flow. The Methuselah Factor is my term for hemorrheology. So we're going to talk about the Methuselah Factor, why it's so important. Here's a list, 4 things right out of the box that are connected with blood flow. May sound obvious: stroke and heart attack, coronary artery disease, but what about blindness? Even cancer is associated with optimal blood fluidity. Cognitive decline. If you don't have good blood fluidity, your mental faculties cannot be kept as sharp throughout the lifespan. High blood pressure. Worse blood fluidity means higher blood pressure. Diabetes, more problematic if you have a poor Methuselah Factor. You'll be more likely to gain weight or find it more difficult to lose weight if you're overweight. Arthritis, more of a problem if you have blood flow problems. And then just getting old. Age-related physical deterioration has been linked to poorer blood flow. And some of you are sitting here, you're young, you say, I don't have any of these problems. Why am I even sitting here? It's because the researchers have found that if you want to perform optimally at any age, you want to have good blood fluidity, good hemorrheology. So let's look at a few of these examples. I could spend, as I do in the book, a lot of time that would take us hours to go through all these connections, but let me just give you a few examples and show why this is important, and then try to help you see how you could improve your own blood fluidity. Let's look at the examples of stroke and heart attack. Stroke is definitely connected with blood flow properties, and in this very interesting research from nearly 2 decades ago, researchers compared people who had circulatory issues with their brain. They either had a stroke or a TIA, which is just like a stroke, but it resolves on its own within 24 hours. They compared these people with those who had no evidence of blood flow problems to their brain. And what they found that was so interesting is all of these indicators of blood fluidity, the worse they were, the more strokes and the more TIAs people had. Let's go through this list. These are some things that determine how fluid your blood is. Do any of you know what hematocrit is? Hematocrit is literally the percentage of your blood that is made up of red blood cells. Here's the question. Should you desire a high hematocrit or a low one? I should give you a disclaimer here. One of my careers in the past has been a college teacher, and I always like to ask trick questions. Not necessarily on tests, but in the classroom, because I find they got people to think. That was a trick question, because you don't want either a high hematocrit or a low hematocrit. You want one in the middle. Let me explain this to you by telling you a true case series. Some of you know perhaps that there is a sport, a professional sport, that has for decades been preoccupied with hematocrit. It is elite cycling, bicyclists, okay? Some of you may remember, going back some decades, cyclists who were illegally raising their hematocrit. The way they did it back years ago, before we had drugs like we have today that could do this artificially, is they would do what we call an autologous transfusion. It plays out like this. A few months before the race, the cyclist would go into his friendly doctor who is going to be complicit in the cheating scandal. The physician would take the cyclist, lay him down on a table, and they would put a needle in his vein and take out a pint of blood. It was mixed with the appropriate preservatives and put in the refrigerator. A month later, the cyclist would come back. Remember, it starts 2 months before the race. When he comes back a month later, what do? They don't give the blood back yet. They take another pint of blood. Again, mixed with preservatives into the refrigerator. The night before the bicycle race, then the cyclist shows up to the doctor's office. I'm sure he's going through the back door. And this time, instead of taking blood, they give him his 2 units back. You see, the stress of the blood loss, when he donated the blood, has stimulated his own marrow to replete his hemoglobin and hematocrit. Now he gets a hyperinfusion, if you will, of his own blood cells. He can carry more oxygen. Can he perform better? He actually can, but there's a price that he pays. Higher hematocrit impairs hemorrheology. And the record shows that 20 or more elite cyclists died in the context of races, either during the race or shortly thereafter. Why? Presumably they became dehydrated somewhat during the race, and as a result, then what happened? That blood that was already flowing less fluidly, now, you got it, now resulted in a fatal event, either a stroke or a heart attack, okay? And this is an appropriate time for some somber music, I agree, because this, no, really, it really is, because this is a terminal event in a healthy person, and it's all because they had a bad Methuselah factor. Dare I say it? They were trying to improve on the Creator. Interesting, isn't it? Well, the other things on this list include plasma viscosity. Viscosity, well, if I were to have a water bottle up here and I were just to pour it on the floor, those keeping such good hygiene here and nice environment in this auditorium would be disappointed. But how quickly would that water pour out? Pour out very quickly, right? Water has low viscosity. If instead I were to take some honey, some good Middle Eastern honey, and pour that out, would it pour out as quickly? No, but it would likely make me more enemies among the janitorial staff, right? The honey would be a lot more difficult. It's a more viscous substance, difficult to clean up. So the lower the viscosity, the better as far as blood fluidity. Fibrinogen is a plasma protein, a clotting factor. The lower your fibrinogen level, the better the blood flow. And the tendency of red blood cells to stick together or to aggregate, the more that happens, the more your blood flow is impaired. What I'm simply trying to help you see, no matter what indicator of hemorrheology they looked at, the worse that measurement was, the more strokes they had. You say, okay, well, how much difference did it make? Let's look at it in terms of another condition compellingly linked to poor hemorheology. This time we're looking at heart attack, okay? Let's look at heart attack. And heart attack was studied in this prospective study. They measured markers, indicators of blood fluidity, and they looked at whether they could predict serious heart events. These would be like a proven heart attack, death from a heart attack. And look at these remarkable differences. These bars, the blue bars, represent people who are in the 20% of best values in the population. The orange bars represent the 20% of the population that have the worst values. So this is not looking at the upper 1% and the lower 1%. This is looking at, nearly half the population, 40%. You're looking at the 20% that have the best values, the 20% that have the worst, and you're comparing them, and it's staggering. If you have a high fibrinogen level, making you have a poorer Methuselah factor, poorer hemorheology, what does that do? That increased their risk of having a serious heart event nearly fourfold. The same was true of viscosity. And then here's a really surprising one on the list, white blood cell count. Some years ago, I got a call from a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, lived many hundreds of miles from me. He said, Dr. DeRose, I just got bad news. My doctor measured my complete blood count, and he said my white blood count was too low. He said, I need to start eating meat to raise my white blood cell count. Well, being the good physician that I was, I told this dear Adventist pastor, I said, you do not need to eat meat. I know a much better way to raise your white blood count. And he said, what's that? I said, start smoking. His reaction was similar, like, what? It's true. Cigarette smoking is a very effective way to raise your white blood cell count. But he was starting to connect the dots. I tell people white blood cells are like the police officers, the police cars in your body. Now, I've heard you don't have a lot of crime here in the UAE, so you probably don't need many police cars. But do you have police cars around here? Okay. So let me give you a picture here, a mental picture. You tell me how this sounds. So you drove here, let's say, to camp meeting, and let's say you live an hour away. And as you're driving back home, you start to see more and more police cars. The closer you're getting to your home, the more police cars. How many of you are starting to say, well, this is wonderful. I'm so glad that, that my emirate is ramping up the police protection. I'm feeling so good. How many of you, that's your reaction? How about if you pull up to the block where you live and you just see more and more police cars? And as you pull up to your home, there are 5 squad cars in your driveway. How many of you are saying, I am so glad? Why are you shaking your heads no? What does this indicate? Yeah, this indicates there's a problem. It's the same with your body. If you have a high white count, this indicates that there's a lot of crime in your body. You're exposing it to those 7,000, actually more than 7,000 chemicals in cigarette smoke. And your body's saying, we got to make more police cars. This is really bad. You're eating meat, animal products. Your body says, this is bad, this is damn. We got to ramp up our inflammatory processes. This is harmful. So a high white count is not desirable. Yes, you need white blood cells to fight infection. But you'll make all that you need on an excellent lifestyle. Here's what happens. If you go on our free 30-day lifestyle program, or if you have a residential program that you offer here one day in this part of the world, people come there for a week or 2 weeks, and we measure their complete blood count at the beginning of the program, and then a week or two later, I can guarantee you that as a group, their white blood cell counts will go down because they're getting on a healthier lifestyle. Higher white blood counts impair blood flow. They impair blood fluidity. Another connection with the Methuselah factor. So we could take time, and I do. I take a whole chapter in the book to go through each one of these things. Blindness, macular degeneration, glaucoma, diabetic complications. If you're concerned about those things, you want to improve your hemorrheology. Cancer, though, this one, people really scratch their heads about it. They say, I can understand stroke. Yeah, stroke is related to blood supply to the brain. I can understand heart attack, blood supply to the heart. Vision problems, yeah, I guess if you don't have good blood flow to your eyes, you could have vision problems. But people really they say, well, how could cancer be connected with blood fluidity? Let me give you one example, and this is an interesting one. Like I said, we could spend a lot of time with this, but this is a study of women who had female cancers. They measured markers of blood flow, hemorrheology, prior to their surgery for gynecologic cancer. So they either had cancer of the ovaries, cancer of the cervix, which is the opening of the womb, and they noticed something that should be unsurprising to you. The worse their blood fluidity, the greater the likelihood of them having a clot after the surgery. You say, well, that's obvious, right? Blood flow related. But here what was so shocking. They found when they measured viscosity, this indicator of hemorrheology, that if a woman had a higher viscosity level when she was diagnosed with cancer than had her surgery, she was more likely to die from her cancer or from other causes when they followed her over time. And the question was, well, why would that have to do with dying from a cancer? Why, if you had better blood fluidity, would it increase your survival from cancer? Here's what the authors wrote, and I'll read exactly what they wrote in the medical journal. By the way, it was published in a journal called Clinical Hemorrheology and Microcirculation. Yes, there are entire journals devoted to this topic. It's not just some esoteric topic that I dreamed up one night, when I was randomly looking through a medical dictionary. Here's what they said. In gynecologic cancer patients, in other words, women with female cancers, the combination of an increase in RBC aggregation and plasma viscosity, so these two measurements of blood flow, right? So when these are higher, what's going to happen? It's going to impair blood flow properties. That's just what we've been talking about. And it may induce hypoxia in the microcirculation. What they're saying in so many words, if you don't have good blood flow in those tiny capillaries, if the red blood cells can't get through there delivering the oxygen, then something very interesting is going to happen. It says it is going to favor thrombosis. That's microclots in the tiny blood vessels. Well, why would that be bad with cancer? When you have cancer, cancerous cells are slipping off from the cancer. If those cancerous cells lodge in a clot in the microcirculation that's now relatively isolated from your immune system, they can set up camp there and set up metastasis before your immune system can check it. The tumor cells settle in those microthrombi and set the stage for spread of the cancer. Well, we could go through this whole list, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to remind you. You want healthy brain power, you want better blood fluidity. You want better blood pressure, you want better blood fluidity. You want less diabetes and less diabetic complications, you want better blood fluidity. If some of you are being stressed by the rapidity at which I'm going through the slides, I am going to give our good pastor there, Kareem, permission to share the slides. You have the copy of the slides. If anyone wants the slides, you can share those with him. So he has a copy of all my slides, and you can be in touch with Kareem and get those slides. So if you want this, or if you want the a single slide, you can take a picture, no problem there, but those are for you. More details, of course, in the book, and more details in a video series. I haven't told this to the Colemans, but I'll give you a free copy of the, and I know I'm going to confuse you by this, but I've got a special video series that I'll leave with you, okay? So you'll also have that resource. Now, those of you that were in my presentation this morning, we talked about natural lifestyle strategies for blood pressure, and I showed you a similar slide to this. I know it doesn't project real well here, but there are actually two bars there, and it's showing that when you use the kind of principles that we've been using and that I'm going to tell you about to improve hemorrheology, you can dramatically lower blood pressure. And this slide shows that people going through a community program that was offered in Seventh-day Adventist churches on average lowered their blood pressure 17 points systolic by employing the principles that we're talking about in as short a time as 4 weeks. Here's the program that we've mentioned. If you've not already taken a picture or jotted this website down, I encourage you to do so. And I really would encourage you not just to jot it down. If you have a smartphone, sign up for the program right now. www.timelesshealinginsights.org. When you sign up, you will get a free 30-day program. That 30-day program, every day a specific lifestyle goal that is designed to help you improve your blood fluidity. If you were to have a copy of my book, The Methuselah Factor, you would notice something striking. The last 30 chapters of that book, 1 chapter per day, roughly about 5 pages, giving you guidelines for that day of the program. Would you like to know those challenges in the book? Each daily challenge in that book is the same as the daily challenge in the videos. What I'm trying to tell you is you don't have to rush out and order the book on Amazon. You can just sign up for the free program. You'll get all the daily goals there. And we've taken it one step further. The most important chart in the book, the first day that you get your email when you sign up, you'll get free handouts, and one of those handouts is figure 15 in the book that allows you to chart your progress over 30 days. So it's all there for you. If you want to do this program in your church, you can just print those out. We're allowing you to use those copyrighted materials in your churches free of charge. You don't even have to ask me for permission. Okay? So we want to hasten on now with that. I think you've gotten the main points, but I'll take any questions at this point about the connections with the Methuselah factor, because if you don't think it's important, there's no reason to tell you how to improve it, okay? So I tried to give you enough information for you to be saying, what can I do to improve my blood fluidity? If you're there, you're exactly where I want you, and we'll talk about how you can improve your blood fluidity. If you've got some lingering questions or the dots have not fully been connected, we want to give you an opportunity to ask any questions right now. Anyone have a question about what we've presented? I see a hand right here kind of in the middle of the audience, back over here. It might be Shiloh if I'm seeing him correctly.
After him, Doctor, could you please just share for a few minutes on blood fluidity and weight gain? You kind of passed that.
Yeah, I did. I definitely passed it very quickly.
Thank you for that, Dr. DeRose. I just wanted to know, how can you measure blood flow? Okay. If now you think, okay, as a way of prevention, how, can that be measured?
Yes, it's a great question. So we can directly measure things like fibrinogen, like viscosity, like hematocrit. But here's what I've told people, and I've given this lecture in many places throughout the United States and throughout the world. I tell people, if I was a really good businessman, I'd have someone in the back there, and I'd say, normally it would cost you $400 to do all these tests, but we have a bargain for you today. For $250, we'll do this hemorheology profile. They're actually not cheap tests. I mean, CBC is cheap, complete blood count. Hematocrit, you can even do with a finger stick. But some of these tests, some of these determinants are actually fairly expensive, and they're not commonly done. What I tell people is, I don't want you to check your hemorheology and said, oh, it's better than my wife's, so I don't have to drink much water now, okay? Oh, I don't really need to exercise that much more. My whole point is this: let's look at the things that improve your blood fluidity. All of us should be trying to improve our blood fluidity as much as possible. So that's the message, rather than getting preoccupied with, checking a bunch of tests that are going to probably be quite expensive even here and then repeating them, okay? So great question. Do we have, I know you wanted to see these slides. So this is a slide of some 13,000 people. They looked at tendency to weight gain. And what you're seeing here is those in the bars, the set of bars to the right. We have some interesting things going on with the colors on the screen, but maybe our connection isn't the best. Anyway, those are supposed to be yellow bars to the right. They look pink to me. And the blue bars on the left of each set. Those blue bars are people with better values, and the pink or yellow bars, however it's showing up on your screen, are the ones with worse values. And you can see significantly increased risk of gaining weight with any of these different determinants of blood fluidity. And people say, well, why would that be? If you're not getting good circulation to your, if you're not getting good oxygenation, put it this way, to your tissues, what happens is your metabolism is not as efficient. Some of you, if you've studied metabolism, aerobic metabolism, when you're getting adequate oxygen to your tissue, is the most efficient. Anaerobic metabolism is less efficient. And so you're actually helping to not only have a healthier microcirculation, but burn calories more effectively. That's one of the explanations. Okay, any other questions before we tell you what you can do to improve your blood fluidity? Okay, I think we're all tracking together. If your hand was up, I missed you, and we'll pick it up when we take some questions later on. So we're thankful the Lord continues to bless people with the Methuselah Factor book. It's a popular book on Amazon, and like I said, the last 30 chapters give you a daily step-by-step program. I'm going to take those 30 steps and try to combine them into 10 that we can hopefully surround in our limited time together, okay? So the first one is, believe it or not, to donate blood. Interesting study from Europe some years ago, they found that regular blood donors, people who donated blood 4 times a year, on average had a systolic blood pressure 12 or 13 points lower than their peers. The bottom line, most of us actually have more red blood cells than we need. And instead of this being an asset when it comes to blood fluidity, it is a detriment. Donating blood not only can help your community, it can actually help you. Isn't that interesting? How many of you see a gospel illustration there? Sharing your blood can be a blessing to you as well as to your community. Drinking more water. There is no beverage that takes the place of water. I'm surprised as I speak to Adventist audiences that even though this study, I mean, you look at it, it was published when? Way back 20 years ago. Dr. Jacqueline Chan at Loma Linda University. I remember talking with Jackie shortly after the study came out, and she was saying that her peers were saying, you know, looking at water drinking and thinking that's going to affect mortality. I mean, I think you're wasting your time. A number of her colleagues told her that. But it was striking. If you look at just a few glasses of water a day, what difference it makes. There are many Seventh-day Adventists, at least when the study was conducted, that were not even drinking 2 glasses of water a day. So if you're in that category, don't feel bad. You're in good company. Well, maybe I shouldn't say good company, okay? But you're definitely not alone. But look what happened. If they drank more than 5 glasses of water, it cut their risk of heart attack in half. I mean, this is powerful, okay? They give people drugs that are not this effective, okay, to try to lower their heart disease risk. So just drinking more water. Now, I was actually giving this lecture in Lebanon. On this trip, we spent some time in Lebanon as well, and someone asked if other beverages were just as good, and I showed them the next slide. And you can see there it was the opposite with all other beverages. Now, some of you might tell me something like, but you like red clover tea. Now, let me just explain. This is looking at a large section of the Adventist population when the research was done. Not a lot of Adventists cumulatively at that time were presumably drinking red clover tea, nor hibiscus tea. One of you asked me about some of the natural things that can lower blood pressure. One of the natural substances that we recommend in our book, 30 Days to Natural Blood Pressure Control, is hibiscus tea. We have a whole chapter on natural therapies for natural supplements for blood pressure. So yes, some of these things might be useful, but what are the average beverages that even Adventists are drinking? They're drinking their juices and milk and other things, soft drinks. These things were deleterious when it came to heart health. Water, interesting. Not only is hemorrheology, if it's better, desirable as far as losing weight, we actually know some of the mechanisms about it. This is very interesting. This is research again from Europe. Dr. Boschman and his colleagues found that if you drink a half liter of water, it's got to be pure water. You can't have, infused with vitamins and minerals and all these things. It will improve your metabolism 24% for an hour. It actually helps you burn more calories when you drink pure water. Caffeine, we talked about earlier, is not your friend when it comes to lifestyle. Caffeine has been called, do any of you remember what Pavlov called caffeine? Any of you? This is we're testing your memory. If you can't come up with this, you definitely need to go on the 30-day program, okay, to improve your cognitive performance. Yeah, I hear bad habit glue. Bad habit glue. So caffeine makes it more difficult to develop new habits, and it makes it easier to go back to the bad habits. So if you've had addictions, if you had problems in that way, you want to get the caffeine out of your life. Caffeine is also really bad for blood fluidity. I'm not going to go through all the reasons, but I want you to appreciate one of them. It has to do with something called adenosine receptors. Those of you that are health professionals know that adenosine is something very important used in life or death situations. When someone has a heart attack, when they collapse with a heart problem. And adenosine may be one of the agents that is used in that life or death situation. Well, caffeine actually blocks this helpful compound. It blocks adenosine. You say, why would anyone use it then? Well, let me tell you what adenosine does. Adenosine actually does some interesting things. It relaxes your blood vessels. In other words, it helps blood flow. Adenosine makes your platelets less sticky. That's also good for your blood flow. Adenosine blocks stress hormones, which is good for all of us because most of us deal with a lot of stressors. But if you are tired and you block adenosine, it will raise stress hormone levels. Are you starting to make a connection here? Why do people resort to caffeine when they're tired? They block adenosine, it raises their stress hormones, it wakes them up. But the price you're paying is it's constricting your blood vessels, it's making your blood less fluid, if you will. It's impairing your Methuselah factor, and this is damaging. I want to hasten on. You got the idea that the most important beverage you can drink is water. Alcohol is a loser. Maybe we'll touch on that in our final presentation. But one of the single best things you can do to improve your blood fluidity is just eat as many whole plant foods as possible. Some years ago, I had a contract with a small medical publisher, and we were doing some literature research, going through the literature, looking at something called phytochemicals. Phytochemicals are some of the best sellers in health food stores, okay? Whether you're talking about things like lycopene or resveratrol or zeaxanthin or lutein, there's a whole list of these things. Literally hundreds, thousands of phytochemicals have been discovered. Phytochemicals, multiple phytochemicals, have benefits on blood fluidity. So when I was doing this research for this publisher, I was already a total vegetarian, but my background, you may not judge this from looking at me, but 3 of my grandparents were born in Italy. And I grew up eating lots of white pasta. You follow along with me? Now, you may or may not realize this, but once you refine a whole plant food, you lose a lot of the benefits. Not just things like bran, but also things like phytochemicals. And when I was doing this research, I said, you know, there's only so much room in my stomach We've already learned we don't want to overeat. So wouldn't I want to emphasize the foods with the most nutrient density? And the foods that give you the most bang for your buck, the most nutrition per calorie, are your whole plant foods. That's where you get these health-giving phytochemicals in maximal amounts. Let me just give you one example, the anthocyanins. These are found in red pigmented foods like grapes and apples, berries, cherries, tomatoes, onions, and garlic. Some of them may not seem all that red, but anthocyanins, very powerful compounds. Look at what they do. They're antioxidants and anti-inflammatory. That combination almost always helps blood fluidity. Inflammation's bad for blood flow. It helps your blood vessels relax. That's going to help your blood flow. By the way, it has an added benefit of helping activate cartilage repair. So if you have arthritis, these compounds are very desirable, and they have cancer preventive effects. We could go through a whole list of phytochemicals. We don't have time to do it. We cover a number of these in the book, but I do want you to realize all of them found in those whole plant foods that God has provided for us, okay? So, more plant foods. Let's go on. We've got a few minutes before I take your questions. We've got 2 minutes for me to cover the rest of these points. But let me share this with you, because one of you was asking me. Someone says, if we go on the 30-day program, do we have to go on zero sugar? Do we have to look at all the labels? We can't eat any sugar. No, no. We ask you to read labels and look at 2 things on the label. Look at the total carbohydrates and the sugar. High sugar content also impairs blood fluidity. There's a number of reasons for it, but it does, including raising your triglycerides. Total carbohydrate divided by sugar. In this example, the ratio is 8. Is that a good number or a bad number? It's actually pretty good. Anything 5 or higher, we say is acceptable on the Methuselah Factor program. So we're going to ask you, if you go on that 30-day program, start reading labels. Now, we introduce these things at different points in the program, so you don't have to do that the whole 30 days. Be patient. It comes up later in the program. We say for the next 12 days of the program or whatever, we want you to add this element to the program. So we're adding these things sequentially. Do you see how that works? But very important is to keep that sugar content down. Ideal weight, very important. Regular physical exercise, another very important principle. I'm glad some of you are speed readers. Others of you are realizing that you're getting stressed by me going through these slides so quickly. Even 5 minutes of exercise on a daily basis can be beneficial. I love this. Listen, this is worth the whole price of the lecture today. By the way, what did you pay to come here? The field was very generous, right? But some of you had quite a bit of expense getting here. This is Ellen White in the book My Life Today. Write this reference down, page 136. This will transform your exercise habits. Go out and exercise how often? Every day, even though some things indoors have to be neglected. And then here's the $1 million quote. This is cutting-edge hemorrheology written by Ellen White decades ago. And by the way, just full disclosure, when I first became a Seventh-day Adventist, I wanted nothing to do with Ellen White. Okay, I'm just telling you, I'm just being honest with you. I wanted nothing to do with her, and I just wanted to study the Bible. And the Holy Spirit got me actually looking at the book Desire of Ages, and Holy Spirit started speaking to me, started reading these messages that I concluded were from God himself to me, helping me, my spiritual walk, my physical walk. Let me give you this next one, because this is cutting-edge hemorrheology. Morning exercise in walking in the free, invigorating air of heaven, or cultivating flowers, small fruits, and vegetables is what? Is necessary to a healthful circulation of the blood. What is she talking about? This is hemorrheology. This is the Methuselah factor. She just didn't use the term. She says it's necessary for optimal hemorrheology. We're paraphrasing, okay? And then what does she say? It is the surest safeguard against colds, coughs, and 100 other diseases. When COVID, this book came out just shortly before COVID. When COVID came out, I looked at the research. I said, hey, you improve your blood fluidity, you're going to decrease your risk of serious problems with COVID or any other infectious disease. And we put out a little video, free video that you can get online that deals with that. We also put it in those videos that I'll give you. My Life Today, page 136. Do some exercise every day. Most of you I'm not worried about. You're not smoking, but this is really bad for your blood fluidity. By the way, it's really bad for your brain. Many studies linking smoking to dementia, and some of that likely has to do with the blood flow damaging effects of cigarettes. You saw that one fly by quickly. Get adequate amounts of vitamin D year-round. Get adequate sleep every night. Some of you, if you're feeling weary, you had to close your eyes just seeing those slides flying by. That's okay. If you fall asleep, it will help your blood fluidity. Number 9, make dental health a priority. And number 10, even if I stressed you with the rapidity of the slides, control stress. Very important. We tried to save 5 minutes for your questions. So let's take those right now. I went through a lot. The best way to go through this really is start with that free 30-day program.
Thank you so much. So a question I had about the blood circulation. You said the first thing that you can do to help it is to donate blood. And so the question is, there's a very popular practice in this part of the world where they do cupping, and it's more localized versus just taking a sample that seems to be more systemic. So if you have brain problems or if you have a problem in your knee or something, you can do cupping around that area. So what would you say regarding this in terms of how it will affect your hemorrheology?
I'll tell you something very interesting. Here's what I've found. I haven't studied cupping in detail, but I've noticed something interesting. If you look at practices that have been perpetuated in cultures, especially for decades and centuries, even though there may be a component of placebo effect, even though there may be some false cosmologies or worldviews, things that are even contrary to biblical values, if something has been perpetuated in a society, there almost always is some physiologic benefit. You know, in the United States, there was practices of bloodletting. In fact, an excellent book, D.E. Robinson's book, The Story of Our Health Message, speaks about the Adventist health message, starts by speaking about the times of our ignorance and speaks about how our first president in the United States, George Washington, was bled to death. You say, why would anyone, false ideas, bleeding out the bad humors. But what they were doing, small amounts of bloodletting would improve hemorrheology. So I could postulate that cupping, as it draws blood to the surface and causes, some hematomas and things, that it's actually maybe drawing some blood out of the circulation and may actually have some benefits. But I say that guardedly. First of all, because I don't know. But second of all, because you can be sure in these indigenous practices there's some false cosmologies, that it's balancing the humors or doing something that we wouldn't endorse physiologically. But don't just say it's all a bunch of nonsense. Just one related example. Well, listen, we have limited time. You want other examples, talk with me and I can't. Who's got another question we're trying to get in?
Thank you for the lecture. I just want to ask, for most of us, as we are sitting here, we're working in the Saudi Arabia here in UAE, and we have extreme heat. To get our optimum level of vitamin D, what is the number if we're going to take our blood test? What should it be at least that we can benefit of supplements that we need to help us to get that vitamin D level up?
Now, there's 2 different units of measurement that are used. The units we use in the United States, I like to see them in the 50s. I know there's other measurements that are used, but in the U.S. we say below 30 is abnormal. We like to see it at least in the 50s. If you have questions, if you're using different units here, if that somehow doesn't sound right, I can help you between the lectures with the conversions. Okay? Other question?
Hi, Doctor.
Listen, I want to make an announcement. So I've communicated with the speaker for the next session, and he's allowing us to go 5 minutes longer if the media team will let us. Can we go 5 minutes longer in this session, and the following speaker will sacrifice 5 minutes? By the way, the following speaker is me, too. Okay. Go ahead. What's the question?
Thanks, Doctor, for that lecture. My question is on the supplements. You spoke about the phytochemicals. I do not know if I missed a point, but when you talk about phytochemicals, there are a lot of supplements on resveratrol, leukopen, and so many other things. And would you recommend people to go for supplementation when they want to get these phytochemicals, or is it the whole food plant-based diet what you recommend?
Yes, very good question. I'm sorry that didn't come through clearly. What I'm saying is, let's put it this way. If you go to a health food store, you can only benefit from the phytochemicals that have been discovered and isolated and that they're selling. If you eat the whole plant foods, you're not only getting the phytochemicals that have been discovered, but ones that haven't been discovered yet. And scientists estimate there are tens of thousands that have not been discovered yet. How they estimate that, what they haven't discovered, don't ask me, but I've seen it in print, okay? But my point is simply this. Yes, the emphasis is on those whole plant foods, not on the supplements, okay? But this fellow had the mic a while ago, right? Yes.
Yes, doctor. My question is about supplements as well. Especially these days, when you go to the gym, people are really into supplements, especially protein. I would say whey protein, and you also have the plant-based proteins. What is the effect of taking proteins in your blood circulation, especially with your subject, hemorrhagiology?
Yeah, so protein has a number of interesting effects, okay? So yes, of course you need protein structurally. You need it for muscle. There's no question about that. But if you actually look at the amount of protein that we ingest, they've studied this research goes back decades, many decades. And they found that if you're eating a balanced, even whole plant food diet, you're getting all the amino acids that you need. Now someone says, but I need extra because I'm really on a rigorous training program. Well, if you're going to take a protein supplement, I would definitely not use whey, okay? So the animal proteins have been, it's their relationship of the amino acids in the animal proteins. We could give a kind of a lengthy explanation, but let me make it as simple as possible. These blends of amino acids are similar to the blends in your own tissue, okay? They tend to promote inflammation, and they have another detriment, and that is they tend to raise cholesterol levels. So milk proteins are one of the most effective proteins at raising cholesterol. So if you're going to use a protein supplement, first of all, most of you don't need it. If you really feel, you're working with a trainer and a dietitian and you want to take like a pea protein or something like that, a plant-based protein, that would be the way to go. But remember, even when you do that, you're getting a phytochemically depleted product. Okay, it's a refined product. And protein in general, the byproducts of protein can make more of an acid residue on the body, which can be hard on the bones. The proteins are also harder on the kidneys. So we have a world epidemic of kidney problems. We're trying to limit protein intake for that reason. Okay? We have another question? Okay. Make sure you have the mic so everyone can hear you, please.
Good afternoon, doctor. I just wanted to find out how much, what should your age be where you stop donating blood? Because my wife and I donated blood, and we donated about 45 pints. Of course, you mentioned it's the first thing there for donating blood. But after that, I collapsed because they said I needed vitamin D in my blood and that kind of thing. So does age play a major part in the donating of blood?
Okay, excellent question. Let me tell you this, first of all, about criteria for blood donors. They continue to change, and they may differ between different organizations. I know this firsthand. I was speaking with a director of a large blood bank in the United States, and they would accept blood at that blood bank from donors that other blood banks wouldn't accept from. So I know of some places that have age limits. Others do not have age limits, okay? So it's not, if you think about it, physiologically, someone could be in their 80s and could be healthier than someone who's 55. So usually, I would say the most cutting-edge blood banks are not using arbitrary designations, but they're using biometric things, lifestyle things, environmental things. So if you've been told you can't donate blood, don't take that for a final answer. Consider going back again. It is very important that you go to donate blood and be very well hydrated. So the biggest problem with blood donation is you go in, you're a bit dehydrated, they take a bunch of blood, you're more prone to be lightheaded, pass out or something. I, as a young man, when I was a teenager, donated blood and had a bad experience like that, and I didn't donate blood then for many years. Didn't realize one of the things to do is be well hydrated before you go in for blood donation. Well, our time has slipped away. We had allotted till 3 o'clock. We will give you a break, and then we will come back for our final presentation, especially focusing on diabetes. I'll try to go through that material quickly. Some of you gathered. A lot of these lectures I'll sometimes give 4 or 6 hours, so we're trying to, I know it may seem like you're drinking out of a fire hydrant and the doctor isn't explaining things adequately, but I'm trying to give you an overview. I'm leaving the slides with your field so that some of you who are health professionals can use those in your own work. You can study them more. And we have the free resources online. The timelesshealinginsights.org is the best place to start. Let's have a closing prayer as we dismiss for a break. Father in heaven, we want to thank you so much that there is just a wealth of information, and we've only scratched the surface. You are trying to help us realize that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that you love us so much that you've let light shine on our path through modern science, through the words of the Bible, through the counsel of the prophet. Please help us to apply these things in our lives and to use it in our ministry to bless our communities, to touch those around us. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.
was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore. Very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry. From the waters lifted me, now safe am I. Love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me, love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. All my heart to Him I give, ever to Him I'll cling. In His blessed presence live, ever His praises sing. Love so mighty and so true, merits my soul's best song. Faithful, loving service due to Him belongs. Love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me, love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me. Souls in danger, look above, Jesus completely saves. He will lift you by His love out of the angry waves. He's the master of the sea, billows His will obey. He, your Savior, wants to be saved today. Love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me, love lifted me, love lifted me. When nothing else could help, love lifted me.
When feeling overwhelmed by life's circumstances, how do we respond? What would He say to you, to me? My prayer is that whenever we find ourselves asking if God really cares, we can sing triumphantly, "Oh yes, He cares. I know He cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are weary, the long nights dreary, I know my Savior cares. He really does." In 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 to 7, it says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that He may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on Him, because He cares for you."
Welcome back to each one of you. This is my final interactive session with you for the camp meeting. And of course, we're happy to interact with you informally during the course of the camp meeting. I have another plenary session where we'll speak about fasting. But this presentation is designated to be about diabetes. I know a lot of you have had questions and you like the dialogue. So I'm going to try to take a series of slides that I normally cover in 4 hours and just give you kind of an overview for half an hour here. Give you kind of a concept that has really the potential to change your perspective on this condition. And when we talk about perspectives, I think all of us have heard the saying, what you don't know can't hurt you. But how true is that one? In a book that we mentioned earlier, The Methuselah Factor, I share the story of a young man by the name of Sam Ballard. He was a healthy young man living in Australia. His friends challenged him. They dared him to eat a garden snail, a slug. Okay, you know what I'm talking about? And he ate that. That began a over 1 year ordeal where Sam ended up lapsing into a coma. He awoke, like I said, over a year later, a quadriplegic. He had contracted something called rat lungworm disease. He developed a serious brain infection and ultimately died some 8 years later. We tell chilling stories like that, and we tell our kids, don't eat, garden slugs. But there's a lot of other infectious, let's put it this way, non-infectious diseases that we should be afraid of. And the one that I want to focus on right now is really at the heart of most cases of diabetes in the world. It is a condition that's increasing not only the risk of diabetes, but also of heart disease, cholesterol problems, high blood pressure, cancer, infertility. The condition that I'm talking about has been called a number of things. Probably most commonly today it's called the metabolic syndrome. You may have heard of it called Syndrome X or the insulin resistance syndrome. The metabolic syndrome is basically the consequences of insulin not working the way it should. And you can see data like this from the US and from other countries, just like we saw with blood pressure. As we get older, our rates of high blood pressure continue to rise. It's the same with metabolic syndrome. And I want to skip to a little quiz that I want to give you today. We're going to find out if you have the metabolic syndrome. So it gives you an understanding of what kind of factors are involved, what kind of blood parameters, what kind of physiologic parameters are associated with this condition. So remember, the metabolic syndrome are the consequences of insulin not working in your body the way it should. So let's go through this quiz together and see if any of you have the insulin resistance syndrome or Syndrome X or the metabolic syndrome. The first one is, do you have abdominal obesity? By definition, that's over 40 inches waistline for a man, 35 inches for a woman. And if you know centimeters instead, multiply by what? 2.54, and you'll find out what it is in centimeters. What do you use here in UAE for waistline? Inches or centimeters? Both? Okay, fair enough. So you could see there, and you could see if you're from an Asian background, the criteria are even stricter. A lot of people say, well, why are there these gender and racial biases? Why do you make it harder on some populations? It's all based on body habitus, body frame, and other factors and correlations with this condition. Number 2 is triglycerides. If you don't know what your triglycerides are, I say you should give yourself a point. By the way, if you get a point, that's not good. A score of 5 out of 5 would be the worst you could get. 0 is the highest score on this test. So no abdominal obesity, you get 0 points for that one. Triglycerides, if they're below 150, no point there. HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, if it's too low, you would get a point. And you could see criteria there with blood pressure and blood sugar. You say, why is this of concern. The metabolic syndrome, the consequences of insulin not doing its job the way it should, are very, very significant. What causes the metabolic syndrome? I've already explained this to you, insulin resistance, and we're trying to give you this material quickly, and then I'll give you a chance to ask questions here fairly rapidly, because I want you to make sure we're following along together. So this metabolic syndrome, you can have it and not have diabetes. So if your tissues are not responding to insulin the way they should, when insulin response is appropriate, blood sugar goes from your blood, the sugar goes from your blood into your tissues. Insulin also allows amino acids, protein building blocks, to go from your bloodstream into your tissues if insulin is doing its job the way it should. It's the tissues that become the problem, and there's a number of things that cause the tissues to be less responsive to insulin, and we'll talk about that. The question is, why should you care? Why is the metabolic syndrome harmful? Well, first of all, based on our last talk, all of these are blood fluidity factors. You recognize some of them, like fibrinogen and plasma viscosity, but all of these are determinants of blood fluidity. If you have insulin resistance, it worsens your blood fluidity. So one of the things that undermines the Methuselah factor is insulin resistance. It's dangerous. It's increasing your risk of stroke and heart attack, even if you never develop diabetes. So some people say, well, hey, I took that quiz, I only got 1 or 2 points. Am I safe? Unfortunately, the answer is no. So even if you only have 1 or 2 of these things, you're at significantly higher risk of serious adverse events, including things like heart attack. So the more of those components, the more of those 5 factors that you answered in the affirmative, the greater your risk of heart disease and diabetes. Let me give you an example. Study looking at some 6,500 men. And you can see here, as their score went up on that 5-question quiz, the best score is a 0. They have the lowest risk. This is looking at heart disease risk. If you just got one of those questions positive, everything's perfect except your triglycerides run high, then you have a 79% increased risk of having a heart attack or other heart event. It's even worse when it comes to the likelihood of your developing diabetes over time. Remember, it's looking at how insulin functions. So if insulin isn't functioning worse, it should come as no surprise you're at greatly increased risk of developing diabetes. Even just having one of those factors in that 5-question quiz over doubles your risk of diabetes compared to 0 factors. When you have the full-blown metabolic syndrome, increases your risk between 7 and 24-fold over time developing diabetes. So you say, okay, insulin resistance is important, and if we were to take the time, we'd find out that insulin resistance is also associated with a leading cause of infertility. If you're a woman and you're in your childbearing years and you're having trouble getting pregnant, there's a good chance the reason you're having problems is because of insulin resistance. It contributes to something called the polycystic ovary syndrome. Very common, very, very common. If you address the insulin resistance, you can actually improve your fertility. So, and we'll talk about some of those things. Just as an aside, one of you mentioned being on a medication called metformin or glucophage. If you read all the fine print that we as doctors have access to, and you can easily access, the manufacturer's material, the drug information about glucophage or metformin, you'll find something in the fine print that goes like this. Beware if you are a woman of childbearing age. This drug may make you more fertile. Okay? I'm paraphrasing. Why would they say that? Well, I don't know how it is here in the UAE, but in the United States, the doctor gives a woman a medication and she ends up getting pregnant and she didn't want to get pregnant, she can actually sue the doctor. Say, you didn't tell me this drug would make me more fertile, and I'm going to sue you for wrongful life. And in the old days, we said that was bad because the doctor would be obligated to pay for, 18 years of that child's life, as long as they're dependent on the parents. And I sometimes joke with people and say, but now it's even worse because many children in the United States stay with their parents into their 50s. So now they get, can claim 50 years of dependence. Anyway, you can see here some of the signs of polycystic ovary syndrome. If you're a woman and you have irregularity with your periods, you have infrequent periods, sometimes you have very heavy periods, excessive body hair, excess weight, all of these things can go along with insulin resistance. There are cancers, multiple cancers associated with insulin resistance. So this metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance, yes, it's the root cause of type 2 diabetes. That's the most prevalent diabetes throughout the world. We used to call it adult onset diabetes. It is fully reversible in many, many people, especially if caught early on in the disease process. And early in the disease process could be 20 years of diabetes. Just depends on how your body has responded. So the disease process may not have progressed to pancreatic failure as it does in some people over many years, even with what we call type 2 diabetes. But what I'm trying to help you see is this topic of insulin resistance is not just of concern to individuals with diabetes. And if you're doing a program in your church, when you talk about this, say this is a program for everyone. Because just like blood fluidity, all of us should want to have as little insulin resistance as possible. We should want insulin to work as good as possible. I could give you many examples with cancer risk, but I'm going to skip over all of them because we want to get to this key point. And the key point is that all of us should be concerned about having insulin work as well as possible in our bodies. Insulin resistance is largely reversible, and that's where we want to try to spend our time together. This is the single most important slide I will show you. What we've done there in the right side of the graphic under results, this is what I've been going through in rapid order with you. The fact is, when you have insulin resistance, that's the blue bar, it contributes to all the things to the right. It puts you at higher risk of having blood clots and narrowing of the arteries, atherosclerosis. It lowers your good cholesterol, the HDL, raises your triglycerides, increases your risk of high blood pressure. It's the underlying root cause of type 2 diabetes. It increases your risk of many cancers, and it contributes to polycystic ovary syndrome, a leading cause of infertility. We want to spend the rest of our time with the information on the left, but before we do, any questions about the right side of the graphic? Any questions about what I just went over in a lot more rapid order than I would normally? Somewhat straightforward. You feel like you kind of got the bird's eye view here? Okay. So let's talk about the causes. What kind of things contribute to insulin resistance, and what can you do about it? We want to look at a very, very important topic, because I started this topic by telling you we're going to be dealing with diabetes reversal, and this is really a key concept. And do any of you know what setabiet is? That's right, it's diabetes backwards, okay? That's to emphasize the point that diabetes is reversible. In most cases of type 2 diabetes, we can reverse the disease process, and we do it by addressing insulin resistance. This is fascinating to me. Some of you know because you heard me tell you, I do a lot of work with Native Americans. And you may or may not know that Native Americans are among the world's most diabetes-prone populations. This is a study done some couple decades ago, but I could show you more recent data. It is similar. Native Americans with staggeringly high rates of diabetes. This was really clear in a study that I knew one of the lead researchers for, and called the Strong Heart Study. They looked at Native Americans living in 3 regions in the U.S. You can see there the Dakotas, Oklahoma, and Arizona. And this is looking at the older adult population, 45 to 75. You can see over a third of the Native Americans in North and South Dakota had diabetes. In Oklahoma, 40%. In Arizona, over 2/3 of the Native Americans in this age range with diabetes. This is just off the charts, okay? So you would say, well, how could we learn anything from Native Americans? Because this is where we want to go. Native Americans can give us some profound insights into how to reverse diabetes. So why is that? Some years ago, I actually was visiting on the Gila River Indian Reservation, visiting one of our National Institute of Health sites in Arizona. And I was meeting with one of the doctors there, actually a number of the doctors, and they shared with me data on diabetes among this population that you just saw earlier, 68% of whom have diabetes in the range of 45 to 75. You can see that final bullet point, those over 30, 50% with diabetes. And if you go back, not much more than 120 years ago, diabetes was virtually unknown. So there's not been any change in the genetics. It's a change in lifestyle. 40 years later, roughly, in 1940, you can see a dramatic increase from a single case in 4,000 people to 21 cases. But if you were to look at it graphically, it's a very small percentage increase compared to today. This study was published in the 1990s. It is a shocking study. It's what we call a natural experiment. Because a lot of people say, well, I've got diabetes because it runs in my family. Yes, there are genetic factors that can predispose to diabetes, but it is largely lifestyle that actually, as some illustrators have said, lifestyle is what pulls the trigger. It is genetics that loads the gun. Okay, if you like that illustration, fine. Other people think that's a pretty chilling illustration, but let's look at it this way. You're not doomed because of your genetics. The Pima Indians, two populations of them, some living in Arizona today, others living in Mexico. These people are from the same stock. They're cousins, okay? We have all kinds of evidence, genetic evidence, language evidence, archaeologic evidence. These are the same people group. They just separated 700 or 1,000 years ago. But they live very differently today, okay? They live very differently. The Mexican Pimas are on a traditional diet. It's a low-fat diet, high in whole plant foods, high in fiber. The Arizona Pimas, what about their diet? It is more like the typical American diet. Not by their choice. They were moved onto reservations. They were given what we call commodity foods. They didn't grow up eating lard, okay? They didn't grow up, eating animal fat. This is not part of indigenous culture, but they're given this high animal fat diet, a lot less activity. And what do they find? If you look at that bottom graphic, yeah, their cholesterol is worse, their weight is worse, but look at the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. First, look at the women. These are age-matched groups. So you're looking at the Arizona Pimas living more like their natural lifestyle, and the Arizona women, Mexican women living more like their natural lifestyle, the Arizona women living more like the Western influenced lifestyle. And you can see there's about a 4-fold greater risk of having diabetes. Only 1 in 10 of the Mexican women with it, but nearly 4 out of 10 of the Arizona women. They're cousins, remember? Genetically similar. If you look at the men, the difference is even greater. Only 6% of the men studied in Mexico had diabetes, 54% of those in Arizona. What's the difference? It's lifestyle. It's lifestyle. And I could show you data in other populations. It's not just Native Americans. What's really interesting is this. What we found in my work over the years, we've worked with a lot of people, I found that the people who are the most genetically predisposed to diabetes often respond the quickest to lifestyle changes. So it's really exciting. So you say, well, boy, my family all has diabetes. I've got it and I'm young. Well, you may likely have a more reversible diabetes than the person who developed it later in life and doesn't seem to have those predisposing factors. This is very interesting. And like I said, we could show you data from many populations, but the bottom line is the same, and that is diabetes is reversible, largely reversible. So are the complications. This is research that I did and other co-investigators. Some of you know Dr. Zeno Charles Marcel. He was part of this research as well, now with our general conference, and showing that we could reverse neuropathy, diabetic nerve problems, by lifestyle changes. So what are the lifestyle changes? Let's take a look at some of them. What made the difference? I'll give you kind of a quick overview and then we'll take your questions. The most important thing you can get, if you haven't picked it up already, is the website, okay? I don't want any of you to walk out of the room without a picture of this website or written down. If you say, I have no paper, I have no smartphone, then borrow a pen and write it on your hand, okay? Because this is a resource for you, not just for you. You're going to meet someone. I could guarantee you, if you're interacting with people, you're going to meet someone with diabetes or high blood pressure, and you can tell them to go through this program. And this will actually help them, and it'll give you an opportunity of connecting with someone. You can follow up with them, call them in a week, say, did you try that out? How are you doing? It's a great way to make friends in your community. So this is the single best thing I can give you to walk you through a lot of these elements in just 6 minutes a day. How many of you are so busy you couldn't spend an extra 6 minutes on something for your health? Okay, I don't see any hands going up. Well, maybe one person, okay? But no, really, make that investment. And you can see here a lot of churches will have people going through it individually and then say, we're meeting once a week and we're going to support you through this. We're going to see how you're doing. We're going to give group support. And I encourage you to do that. Like I said, all the materials are online. You can download the handouts. You can print them out. You don't have to tell us. You don't have to pay us anything. These are resources for you to use in your health outreach. Okay? So insights to help you today. Let me give you just this list. We'll put this up. We'll talk a little bit about it, and then we'll take your questions. So this is limiting our discussion to diet as far as giving you some tools to work with. Here's some things you can do right now to improve how insulin works in your body. First of all is decrease your fat consumption. The worst fats are the animal fats. Let me try to make this as plain as possible because we talked about this earlier. We talked about the brain. All of you realize that you really are made up of what you eat, right? You've heard the expression, you are what you eat. Really, the tissues of our body are made by what we ingest. Your cell membranes are largely made of fat. If you eat saturated fat, well, let me ask you it this way. Saturated fat, animal fat, is it liquid or solid at room temperature? It tends to be solid at room temperature, right? So if you get a stick of butter and you put it out on your table, well, granted, it gets to 125 here, right? If you don't have air conditioning, it could melt. But the idea is at room temperature, at body temperature, saturated fats tend to be solid. Polyunsaturated fats, plant fats, tend to be liquid. What difference does it make? If you eat saturated fat, it makes your cell membranes more rigid. When the membranes are more rigid, the communication between molecules like insulin, neurotransmitters like serotonin doesn't work as well. So if you want to have the best health, you want to emphasize the plant foods with the polyunsaturated fats. If you're eating those saturated fats, they make the membrane stiffer. It will worsen insulin resistance, among other things. Mineral intake. I alluded to this earlier, but one of the minerals that's associated with both better blood pressure as well as less risk of diabetes is magnesium. Magnesium is especially found in things like beans and seeds. So if you want to get optimal magnesium intake, you want to eat whole plant foods. By the way, in our book, 30 Days to Natural Blood Pressure Control, we looked at 3 important nutrients that are involved in blood pressure. Some of them also, like magnesium, involved in blood sugar. Potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And what we found is if you look per calorie, the best sources for all of these, including calcium, are plant products. It's not dairy. All the top foods when it comes to calcium per calorie are plant products, like your green leafy vegetables. So if you want to get optimal mineral intake, you want to be eating lots of plant foods. What is caloric density? Caloric density is calories per volume. one of the drivers of insulin resistance is extra weight. What they found in people with pre-diabetes is the first manifestation of diabetic risk in predisposed people with the metabolic syndrome. So if you have the metabolic syndrome and your blood sugar starts going up, your fasting blood sugar is above 100, but below 125, we say you have pre-diabetes. There's other criteria for blood sugars after meals. But if your blood sugar's in that range, that shows you that you've got significant problems with insulin resistance, and you are likely on your way to full-blown diabetes. Do you know what the likelihood of getting full-blown diabetes is within a 10-year span if you have pre-diabetes? Do any of you know? It's over 50%. So it's over 10% per year and over 50% in a decade that you will develop full-blown diabetes if you have pre-diabetes. But you can reverse that risk by two big things. One is regular physical activity, and the other is even very modest weight loss if you're carrying extra body fat. Okay? So if you lower your caloric density, that means instead of eating things that have lots of calories per volume, think desserts, think meat, think cheese. Eat things with lots of water and fiber in them, like vegetables, like fruits, like whole grains. And when you fill up on those foods, you fill up on a whole lot less calories. Those same foods also have a better glycemic index. That's the next bullet point. That is tendency for the food to raise your blood sugar. My favorite group of foods I call the leaf, stem, and flower vegetables. Help me out. What would be an example of a leaf, stem, or flower vegetable? I hear broccoli. Yes, that's the broccoli is the stem, and the flower is actually forming. Okay, what other vegetables? Yeah, spinach I heard. What else? Kale, lettuce, celery. Celery is a stalk, lettuce the leaf. So anything that's a leaf, stem, or a flower. When you go through the 30-day program, we use that. We have you using that 30-day program, throughout that 30-day program, some periods of using the leaf, stem, and flower fast. And I'll tell you more about it when we speak about fasting. Look at this next one, decreased percentage of energy intake as simple sugar and other high glycemic index foods. We talked about the glycemic index, but simple sugar, I've already told you some ways to decrease that, and one of the ways is looking at the labels. Look at total carbohydrate and sugar. Here's the most interesting thing to me. I'll have people say, oh, Dr. DeRose, I don't need to look at the labels. When I go to the store, the only thing I buy is the pure organic granola, okay? You know, I don't eat just any junk. Well, you look at a lot of those granolas. Do they sell granola here in UAE? Is that a popular item? Okay, see some of you nodding your heads. And you look, a lot of those granolas, they almost look like candy. I mean, they're loaded with all kinds of sugar. So you've got to read labels, and sugar is masked by salt. So you can be fooled as to how much salt something has or how much sugar, because the sugar and salt offset each other. And it's a very interesting relationship. Native Americans practice temperance principles. We talked about this last night. Not eating between meals. Very important for optimal health. Fasting. We'll talk some more about that, the Lord willing, tomorrow. And then there are certain herbs that have blood sugar and blood pressure lowering properties. Let me tell you two of my favorite, guar gum and psyllium seed husks. I know I'm probably making you hungry if you skipped lunch. No, these really don't have much flavor. But these soluble fibers, are you familiar with guar gum and psyllium seed husk? Have you heard of these? So these are soluble fibers. They help to stabilize blood sugar. So if you incorporate it into a meal. We actually, when I was working in a lifestyle center, we made this into a Jell-O substitute. We took an herb tea base. We added guar gum and psyllium seed husk to it. It made a Jell-O, and people would eat that before their meal, and it would help to stabilize their blood sugar and curb their appetite. Well, I want to take your questions. We've got about 17 minutes. You can ask questions about diabetes or anything else that I haven't covered. If I don't know the answer, I'll be the first one to let you know. Okay, so we've got a couple of roving microphones here. So any questions, first of all, about diabetes? Okay, so I see a hand up and back there. By the way, any question is fair game. Okay, so we've got the white mic we need.
Hello?
Okay, perfect.
Thanks a lot for the presentation, very interesting. I was reading a book which, I forgot the author's name, but very much into running. He was a trainer for the US Army and also a medical doctor. And it's amazing, he also talked a lot about the same things around pre-diabetes and how a lot of people are without recognizing it. But one thing that he said, which I didn't quite agree with, is that he was very strictly anti-carbs, almost to the point of saying like no carbs at all, rather have lots of fat and less carbs. And he was saying how almost everything has just way too much sugar, and sugar is what causes pre-diabetes and all this. It felt to me a little bit like not very balanced, but I just wondered what your thoughts are. Like, is that true that you should really, really cut down on carbs and focus on fats?
Well, let's talk about it this way. It's a great question, and it's a very practical one today. So here's the interesting thing. If you look at the foods that the Creator gave us, if you look at the whole range of plant products, there's actually quite a bit of carbohydrates in many of the foods that the Lord gave us. If you look at the grains, significant carbohydrates, but whole grains, a good protein source as well. Look at the beans. Probably the single, if someone were to say, what food should I eat more of if I want to optimize my health metabolically? If I had to single out a single food group, I mean, there'd be some challenges, but high up on that list would be beans. Early in the 30-day program, we encourage people to use more beans. Beans have a special fiber, and it's worth talking about with diabetes. It's called leguminous fiber. That fiber has been shown to stabilize blood sugars. So you eat legumes with a meal, you eat it maybe with something that's higher in sugar content, and the beans will help to stabilize your blood sugar. Beans also have an interesting relationship with a hormone that we first learned about in medical school in my day with gallbladder emptying. It is a hormone called cholecystokinin, abbreviated CCK. So it's involved with telling your gallbladder to empty when you have a fatty meal. Cholecystokinin is also an important satiety hormone. It tells your brain that it's satisfied. It helps you not to want to snack between meals. Helps you finish eating earlier. CCK levels are maintained better after a meal if you include soluble fiber, like you find in leguminous fiber of beans. So my point is, carbohydrates have a number of beneficial effects, but none of these are as important as a factor that the Wortmans singled out from MIT. I talked with you about brain health the first hour of today, and I didn't cover a lot of the material we touch on in a 2-hour series I have called The Brain Health Revolution. You can find that on our website, compasshealth.net. I've been focusing you on our free website, The Timeless Healing Insights. But Compass Health is where we have our free materials, but we also have a lot of our books and things that you can purchase, compasshealth.net. But there we have the Brain Health Revolution full video series, and in that we talk about the work of the Wortmans. The Wortmans were a husband and wife couple at Massachusetts Institute of Technology who looked at carbohydrates and brain health. This is really fascinating stuff because if you understand what we're dealing with on the world scene, we're dealing with an epidemic of things like depression and overstress. And some of the neurotransmitters that you need to fare best in the mood arena and in the stress management arena are things like dopamine, things like serotonin. These neurotransmitters are made from amino acids. Now, I know this may be getting a little bit blurry, but I'll show you where I'm going with this. The two key amino acids to get in the brain are tyrosine and tryptophan. When you eat a high-protein diet, it interferes with the ability to get tryptophan and tyrosine into your brain. When you eat a high-carb diet, it actually facilitates the movement of these amino acids into the brain. It involves insulin, it involves competing amino acids, but the bottom line is this. If you look at people that go on a no-carb diet, I've never met one that's stuck with it for long term, because you can't maintain good mental health without eating a liberal amount of carbohydrates. So yes, if you leave all the carbs out of your program and go on a ketogenic diet, when you start burning ketones, it's going to suppress your appetite. You know, people will lose weight and they'll say, oh, this is so great, but you can't stick with it. And remember, like we talked about earlier, those high protein diets, they're hard on the kidneys, they raise inflammatory markers. So we don't recommend it. We, in our work in lifestyle centers, so intensive residential programs, you know, we can control the diet. You know, this is, you know, what you have. We let people choose among those options. But we serve a relatively, we actually analyzed our diet in a paper that we published in the medical literature some years ago. It's 60% carbs, but they're mostly complex carbs. People are losing weight. On average, in a few weeks, they lose 4 or 5% of their body weight if they're overweight. Their cholesterols are dropping, their blood sugars dropping, their blood pressure coming down. These are people that needed to lower their numbers. We're not talking about healthy people that they're passing out or getting hypoglycemic. So my point is, really, yes, you can get some benefits from these low-carb diets. And, you know, people are touting them, and, you know, short-term, you know, a trainer might say, hey, you're going to get these benefits from this, or, you know, guy's a competitive wrestler, and he's got to lose weight and get his, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying you can't get some benefits from that, but if you look at the big picture, most of us in this arena just say, you know what, looking at long-term, it just doesn't have what we need. And I have a little bit different perspective than the guy working with all the healthy young people. I'm seeing the 50-year-olds, the 60-year-olds, the 70-year-olds, you know, who did all this, you know, stuff, and now they're paying for it. So that's the perspective that's often lost. Okay, what about other questions? Okay, got a mic over here.
Yes. Yeah. I have known friend that having polycystic ovary syndrome. Okay, she's 38 years old, diagnosed for, I think, 10 years past, but she is still in pain time to time. She's already doing vegetarian, but every time that she has some period or something, she's in pain, and also causing UTI in some part. We went to different doctors, but they said that they cannot do anything for this type of issue that she has. What is your recommendation for for that person?
Okay, no, thank you for the question. So it's really an application question, right? What we've been talking about. So we've mentioned that polycystic ovary syndrome is one of the consequences of insulin resistance. And of course, there are genetic factors and other things. So the person we're talking about may be on a healthier lifestyle than someone who doesn't have PCOS, okay? So it doesn't mean, you know, we've talked about this earlier, you can't blame someone, say your lifestyle is bad, that's why you have this problem. So you might be doing very well, all things considered, but you may have to do more. So what other things could help? Now, it kind of ties in with the last question, and just to try to make sure I'm clear and not confusing. It is still true that some people, when it comes to simple carbohydrates especially, have to be careful. So if you have diabetes, or if you have polycystic ovary syndrome, it is probably not a good idea to eat a whole watermelon alone, okay? Now, I'm not just speaking the quantity, but watermelon has a high glycemic index. It's going to tend to raise your blood sugar a lot. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get on a regimen. You see this list here. We're looking at things that decrease insulin resistance. And one of those things you want to do is you want to avoid those simple sugars, even if they're in a natural state. So we do have to be careful in some people. So if a person's on a generally good lifestyle, and they're not getting progress, then start looking at those high glycemic index foods. So what would they be? They'd be root vegetables. They'd be more of your tropical fruits. They tend to raise blood sugar more. They'd be your refined grains. So those are things to focus on. Physical activity is always important, and we had that reminder again. So physical activity, very important to lower insulin resistance. Exercise itself has an insulin-like effect. So gradually increasing exercise can help. And if there's ways to trim down on the body fat, whatever you can do to do that also helps with insulin resistance. I would recommend being checked for thyroid status. Person sounds like they've seen a lot of doctors. That's probably been evaluated. But thyroid also can factor into this equation. Too much or too little thyroid can be a problem when it comes to the metabolic syndrome. And I really emphasize fasting. We'll talk about it more this camp meeting, but fasting has a metabolic resetting function. And there's people that we've worked with over the years that we incorporate a 1 day a week fast, or sometimes even 2 days a week, or maybe 2 days every 2 weeks. And a water-only fast can actually have a powerful effect on lowering insulin resistance and modulating other metabolic things that can help. So those would be some of the important things that I would consider. Okay? What about other questions?
I have 3 questions.
Okay.
So we have been discussing that diabetes is reversible. That was a profound statement. My first question is, are all diabetes reversible? We know different types out there, but I think we discuss about adult onset diabetes, which is type 2. But my question is, if it is adult onset diabetes, regardless of the duration that they've been suffering from, is it still possible to reverse type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So I'm glad for the question because I went through things very quickly. And first of all, let me make this point very clear. Type 1 diabetes, which is generally an autoimmune destruction of the pancreas, is not reversible, okay? So once the pancreas is destroyed, you can't reverse that. You can help people have normal blood sugar with lifestyle early on in a type 1 diabetic process, but it's actually not in their interest. If you realize it's type 1 diabetes, you're better off starting insulin because they're insulin deficient. It's not a problem with insulin resistance. If you don't start insulin at an early time, then their pancreas will fail even more and make them more of a brittle diabetic. So early insulin therapy is actually beneficial in the relatively small percentage. In the US, it's only about 1 in 20 people with diabetes that have type 1. So 95% of what we see is type 2. That is the type that is reversible if the pancreas has not begun to fail. So remember, the root cause, insulin resistance. We can reverse the insulin resistance. As long as the pancreas can still make adequate amounts of insulin, then we can get the person off diabetic medications. It doesn't necessarily mean how long they've had it. I've seen patients who've had diabetes for 20 years, and their diabetes is fully reversible. Someone else may only have been diagnosed 5 years, but they've already had significant pancreatic function decrements, and they may not be able to get off of all diabetic agents. So it does not necessarily a factor of how long. And how do you tell? What we would do is some indicator of insulin production. The one we have done the most work with is something called C-peptide. C-peptide, you make 1 molecule of C-peptide for every molecule of insulin. But the advantage of it is it stays in the blood longer. So if you measure C-peptide levels, we can actually determine how much function the pancreas has. People that have good pancreas function, within a couple of weeks, we can get them off their diabetic medications. Average function, it may be a longer process. If the pancreas is just not functioning well at all, they're not going to be able to get off of the diabetic medications. Okay?
Thank you. I think you answered my other 2 questions, but I have one last question. We spoke about the sugar intake and the fat intake, And among these two, which one, in your opinion, would be the major cause of type 2 diabetes? Is it the higher lipids that's taken or the sugar?
Yeah, from my reading of the data, actually this is surprising to people who haven't read this, but it seems like the high fat, especially the saturated fat, is a bigger driver of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes than is the sugar intake. So I don't want to minimize sugar intake. Sugar intake will raise blood sugar quickly in the short term, but fat, remember, it's making your membranes more rigid, it's contributing to insulin resistance. That is the root cause of diabetes and is the most important thing to target. So one of the things you can do in your churches is have vegetarian cooking schools. This is a powerful thing to minister to your community. Invite your community to. A lot of interest in this. As I go around the world, it seems like one of the greatest interests, if you want to get your community to a community event, is have a cooking class. Teach people how to prepare foods without so much animal products. I say do a total vegetarian class. You don't have to tell them to become vegans or total vegetarians or whole food plant-based eaters, okay, whatever terminology you want to use. But the more of those items they incorporate into their diet, the better off they'll be. We need to close on that note. I know there's some other questions out there. I'm not going to rush off immediately, but I do want to close with a word of prayer. I do thank you for your attentiveness, your interest in your own health, and your interest in the health of others. Let us pray. Father in heaven, you've been so gracious to us, and we have been, well, honestly, we've not been the most gracious to you. We've sometimes thought that you were trying to mess up our life, somehow take fun out of our lives, somehow make our lives more boring or dull. But Father, I pray that you'd help us to realize that all the light that you shine on our pathway is to bless us and to make us a blessing. And if we realize that, it changes our attitude. Help me not to forget that. Help us collectively not to forget it. And help us not just to know that, but to translate it into action, to know what you want us to do. First of all, Father, I pray for every person who's here this afternoon and who's heard any of my presentations. Impress each one. If there's something specific they need to change, give them the courage to change that and to realize they can develop new enjoyments through your grace. And then I pray that you'd help them know what you want them to do for others with what we have re-emphasized over these 4 hours together. Open up doors for health ministry, doors for gospel ministry throughout this field. We ask in Jesus' name, amen.
Can I have your attention for a couple of minutes? I would just like to remind you that now we will have a prayer session here led by Pastor Shiloh. Also at the same time there is a health screening going on, and the supper is at 5 p.m. and the Friday Vespers begins at 6:30. And for those who are watching us online, we will go back online at 6:30. So for those who would like to stay for prayer, please stay here and Pastor Shiloh will lead us. God bless.